This video is for AP Environmental Science Chapter 9, which is looking at preserving biodiversity at the species level. It starts with a core case study looking at honeybees. Make sure you go over this case study, understand the importance of bees as far as looking at the ecosystem service that they provide, what their role is in their particular environment. So that means understanding what happens if those bees are gone, what happens if we lose that ecosystem service. Make sure as you go through it, you also look at what are characteristics of these particular organisms that make them vulnerable to extinction, as well as what are potential solutions for solving this problem. So some of the big ideas, or one of the big ideas, is understanding that the health of a species is very closely tied to its particular ecosystem. And then, of course, that's going to vary between different species. But also, in most cases, when you have minor environmental changes, that's going to have a large impact on the health of that species. So for Chapter 9, 10, and 11 that we're going to be going into, they all look at how we preserve biodiversity either at the species level, in terrestrial ecosystems, or aquatic ecosystems. So make sure that for all of this, you're able to describe what are the results of human disruptions on those ecosystem services, because there's going to be potential economic effects, there's going to be potential ecosystem effects. So for all of them, it's making sure you understand what are the things that humans are doing that are disrupting these particular ecosystems or at the species level, and what are the impacts. Okay, so moving into the main part of Chapter 9, the first page is looking at the differences in the different types of extinction. It also mentions something right here, which is very, very tiny, but it's a big idea for the AP Enviro exam, which we will talk about in more detail in an activity later on. But it's looking at something called Trophic Cascades. And if you remember, when we talked about food webs and food pyramids and how energy travels through ecosystems, we refer to them as trophic levels. So the idea of a trophic cascade is saying that if you have organisms that occupy the higher trophic levels and they go extinct, they disappear, it has a cascading effect on the rest of that ecosystem. So they talked, for example, there's an example of the wolves of Yellowstone, which we'll look at again in another activity later on. But those wolves have a huge impact on the ecosystem. And so when those wolves are not present, then you start to see this big change, not only in the animals, but also the plants and also the geology in the environment as well. All right, so the other part on this page is making sure that you understand what is the difference between mass extinction and background extinction. Mass extinction is looking at the extinction of many different species in a very short period of geologic time. Understand that throughout the history of life on Earth, there have been about 5 major mass extinctions because of different reasons. And scientists say that we are in the midst of a 6th mass extinction, and that fast, rapid extinction of a lot of different species at the same time, that's happening because of human-caused activities, or what are called anthropogenic activities. Okay, we compare that to something called the background extinction rate, which is looking at the rate of extinction, or the predicted or estimated rate of extinction before modern humans evolved about 200,000 years ago. And so the rate is roughly about 1 species per year for every 1 million wild species that lived on the Earth. But we know there's some flaws with how that's been estimated, and this first section kind of talks about that and looks at that. But just make sure you understand what the difference is between the two terms. All right. The Science in Focus page is looking at calculating and estimating the extinction rates, and kind of focusing on the fact that there are 3 problems with trying to catalog extinction and estimating and predicting extinction rates. And one of the first problems is because extinction, the natural process of extinction, takes a very long time. That means it's difficult to document. And then a second problem is the fact that we have actually only identified approximately about 2 million species out of an estimated 7 to 10 million species. So there's a lot of, we know that there are a lot of species out there, and we've only identified a small percentage of it. And then the third difficulty with estimating extinction rates is for those species that we have identified that have gone extinct, we don't know what their ecological role was. We don't know if they were a keystone species. We don't know if we don't know what their role was in the environment. So it makes it difficult to predict what the sort of ripple effects would have been from that particular species disappearing. All right, so moving over to this page right here, one of the ideas that's mentioned, very, very tiny right here, is something called the Biodiversity Hotspot, which we're going to look at that in class. But remember that biodiversity hotspots are areas around the world that are very high in biodiversity, but at the same time, they have very high rates of extinction, much higher than the global average. And there's a lot of different reasons for that to happen. And again, we'll look at that in class, but just make sure you understand what that is. Moving over here, make sure you understand what is the difference between endangered versus threatened. Endangered, you have so few individual survivors or members of that species that exist that they are soon to be extinct. So the numbers are very, very small. Threatened means there's enough remaining individuals in that species to continue or to keep the species going in the short term, but because the numbers are dropping so quickly, that it's likely that they're going to be in danger in the future. So that's why they're threatened. Threatened is also known as vulnerable. And there is a list that's maintained by the International Union for Conservation of Nature, which we refer to as the Iucn Red List, which identifies and tracks and monitors and keeps track of which species are listed as critically endangered, meaning they will possibly soon be extinct, endangered, or threatened/vulnerable. And so we've seen a major increase in numbers of organisms that are listed at the high levels, whether it's critically endangered, endangered, or threatened. And according to right here in your textbook, it says it's about a 92% increase since the year 1996. So there's a lot of stuff that's been going on. So it's really important to understand what are the characteristics, what are the things that are making some organisms more prone to extinction than others. What are some of the characteristics? Okay, when we talk about different types of animals, amphibians are going to be the ones that are going to be most endangered most of the time, and that has to do with the fact that they are sensitive to changes in water, because with the amphibian life cycle, half of their life cycle is spent in water. Plus they have a lot of amphibians, or all amphibians have moist skin, so you have things that are able to diffuse across their skin. Then, of course, you've got trees, or conifers in particular, mammals, the larger animals, and we'll talk about over here in a second the reason for that, and then birds. So what are some of the major characteristics? Make sure you know this table or this chart very well. Animals that have a very low reproductive rate, they only reproduce 1 or 2 offspring at a time, and they only reproduce every several years. That means their population is naturally going to be smaller. So if there are changes that happen in the environment, their population is not going to be able to react very quickly to those. Another example of a characteristic would be something that has a very specialized niche. So it's got a very specialized habitat and a very specialized role in that habitat. So again, if there's changes in the environment and you are an organism that has a specialized niche, it's going to be really difficult if those changes impact your particular niche. They have a narrow distribution range. They're only found in smaller or certain locations. They feed higher up at the trophic level, and that has to do with the fact that anything that accumulates within, when we get to talking about bioaccumulation or biomagnification, that passes on to those animals. So things that affect species lower down have a greater impact on those things at higher trophic levels. They have fixed migratory patterns. So if you have habitat destruction, if you have anything that happens that disrupts their migration pattern, it's going to make it more difficult for these organisms to reproduce. When you talk about, for example, like they show turtles here because they go and they lay their eggs in specific locations. You have salmon that spawn that go up to specific rivers that are now closed off by dams or things like that. Of course, things that are rare, those are going to be more likely to go extinct than others. Things that are commercially valuable. So here they show a picture of an elephant because of elephants and their ivory. You have rhinos and their horns. You have sharks and their fins. But things that are commercially valuable. And then things that have large territories. So here in Southern California, we have Southern California mountain lions, and we've talked about them before when we talked about island biogeography and habitat fragmentation. So as we build habitat, because they need a large territory, they roam, they have to feed a lot. As we build these freeways in these neighborhoods that break up their habitat, it makes it a lot harder for them to survive.